And so, good evening, friends, and welcome to another lectionary reflection. And tonight we have a very special guest who's with us, and we are super excited to have with us in our lectionary conversation the Bishop Faith Whitby from the Central Synod of our connection. And she has graciously agreed to join us in conversation, and we really look forward to just sharing around the scriptures for this week together with Faith and just hearing some of her insights into the season of Advent. And as we continue to journey through Advent, we're going to take a look a little at what Advent means for us and the role this season plays in the church calendar. Our readings for this week, once again, are readings that might be a little bit out of our normal reading sequence within the scriptures. They're not texts that we necessarily might go to. For example, Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. And then also we have our reading from the gospel, and that's from Luke chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And that's the story of the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. And John the Baptist is kind of the weird guy that we tend to sometimes ignore because we don't quite know what to do with him. But we're going to take a look particularly at that gospel text. And then also our letter for this week is Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 to 11. And instead of the psalm, we have Luke chapter 1, verses 68 to 79. And we sing with the woman of our faith in the gospel according to Luke. And we'll pick that up in our conversation that Luke begins and sort of almost ends in song, and Faith sings in Luke. But just to begin our discussion, firstly, just welcome Faith amongst us online, and just wanted to maybe by way of starting, we're drawing to the end of a year. It's been a rather punishing year for all of us, I think, in many ways, but also a year that's probably taught us lessons. And so maybe just the first question I want to throw out to you is, what are you learning at the moment this year? What has this year been teaching you?
Thanks, Graham, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this wonderful conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to say something that will probably sound quite trite and simplistic, but I actually think that it's very real for me. And that is simply that life is precious. Life for me is truly precious. And I speak not only because of and I think it's a huge weight of loss and grief that COVID-19 that we've all journeyed with in various ways, but also the rediscovery of those moments of grace and hope and joy, sometimes despite the challenges, and sometimes that enable us to, or enable me certainly, to go back into the challenges and engage and connect in different ways. And so the trite expression, life is precious, but for me, it really has meaning and depth, particularly as we get to the end of the year and as we move into the season of Advent, and as we think around what that means for us.
Oh, no, definitely. I think we can all sort of relate to that sense of just not only the weight of grief, but also just the beauty of those moments of connection that we have had. And as we journey towards the end of the year, this is normally a reflective time as we move into Advent. But apart from Advent being sort of a reflective time, it's also sort of a time when we confront sort of this story of Jesus not only having come amongst us, but continuing to be present amongst us, and ultimately is going to define what the future looks like. But what does Advent mean for you at a personal level?
I think Advent is one of those under-recognized, under-acknowledged, ignored seasons in the life of the church. We associate Advent with preparation, but for many of us, I think it's often preparation for Christmas. So whether it's buying gifts or going on holiday or planning family time, and those are all good things. There's nothing wrong with that. But we skip more easily, I think, to what we anticipate as moments of celebration, and miss the gifts of the season. That the preparation is not getting the house ready for Christmas necessarily, but that it's a journey of grace with God. And I think particularly challenging because in the church at this time of the year, we tend to be quite busy because we're rushing towards the end of the year and wanting to tie things up and get diaries done and so on and so on. And Advent then for me becomes, it's a strange thing to say. Sometimes I'm almost caught by surprise. I know it's Advent, but it kind of, oh, it's the first Sunday of Advent already. And what does that mean for me? Can I just continue with my life, kind of do the ritual Advent Sunday candle lighting things and carry on with life as usual? Or is there something more here that I've got to focus on? Where is God in this time, in this space for me, for us? Is there something that God coming in the flesh begins to shift for me, for us? I actually think it's a gift that Advent hasn't been commercialized in the way that other Christian religious and holy days have been. Because I think it gives one a moment to, you can then step aside and set aside. If you step away from the commercialization of Christmas, you can then use this as a season of great preparation in terms of personal growth, spiritual growth, but also connecting with where we are, what's happening in the world, what's happening in the country. Last week, we as a connection, we launched, and engaged with the 16 Days of Activism campaign, which begins always every year just before Advent starts. So how do we connect with the huge levels of gender-based violence in this country, and not sweep it away and say, well, Christmas is coming and we'll be fine and it'll be lovely and it'll be wonderful? How do we connect with that with our theology, with our shaping of our relationships, our communities? And for me, that's where the preparation, the work of Advent is a gift at this time.
Yeah. And I think that sense of preparation is helpful. I think last week in the discussion, I mentioned that, we sometimes also forget that Advent's a purple season. It's a penitential season in the church calendar. And I was just having a conversation with a member of the church who was in a tizzy about getting the windows washed before Christmas. And I thought, we put so much into sort of making sure our houses are clean and done up and everything's ready for Christmas. And do we spend that same amount of time sort of in terms of the internal preparation, the internal cleaning out that a season like Advent affords? And of course, that also means confronting, I suppose, confronting. I prefer not to confront what needs to be cleaned in my house. And I think I do that in my life too, and I think that's why we get these texts that force us also to confront. And as you rightly said, this is a time when we have to confront sort of in our social calendar some very pertinent issues in our society, gender-based violence, and we've also are having this conversation on World AIDS Day. And perhaps maybe, Advent speaks to these two realities. This Sunday we'll be lighting the candle of peace. And so I just wonder, what does peace look like in the midst of gender-based violence? What does peace look like in the midst of disease and pandemic and access to healthcare? What does peace look like in these spaces? Sorry, it's a big question, I suppose.
You want me to answer it? Okay.
But I suppose we all have to imagine what peace looks like in some tangible way. Yeah.
Just thinking the peace, the shalom, one of the ways in which I understand it is that it refers to a wholeness of being. And and that for me, my individual well-being and wholeness is indivisible from the well-being and wholeness of every other, not just every other human being, but of the planet.
Yeah.
You know, I can't be whole and well in a little corner by myself while my neighbor is starving, while the planet burns, because human beings are selfish and stupid, if I may say that,
Yeah.
because it's the only home we have, you know. I can't assume a wholeness in myself when, and we connect, as you said, with World AIDS Day, you know, and we're grateful for the work that's been done in research. We're grateful for our scientists whose capacity has now extended into, you know, leading the world in terms of COVID-19 mutations and just dealing with that. But my wholeness cannot be accomplished or enjoyed, or, and I don't think achieved is the right word here somehow. I wonder if wholeness is also part of a journey, a constant exploration, and that we do it together. We need one another in this journey. So just some thoughts as you speak of peace.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gray. Because I think for me, Advent is the celebration of the mystery of what it means to be enfleshed. You know, like, what does it mean for God to take on skin and bone and story, and what does that then mean for us? So the fact that our wholeness is connected to everybody and this entire planet, and you know that basically none of us can be whole if people are excluded from healthcare, from food security, from inclusion into like spaces of nurture and thriving, and we are connected, and we can try and separate ourselves into little enclaves to protect our illusions of wholeness, but it's not whole unless everyone is part of it. And I think locating or having Advent at the time when we launched the 16 Days of Activism, when it holds, provides a faith circumference for World AIDS Day, we recognize that God comes to us in the bodies of all human beings. And we are invited and asked to create homes with each other. So that's, for me, important parts of Advent, I think.
Yeah. And I think Advent invites us, and Shalom invites us firstly to befriend our brokenness, because we can't find our way to wholeness without befriending our brokenness. And we often want to run away from our brokenness, our participation in the brokenness, that particularly sort of the complex social issues that we struggle with. We participate in all of them to some degree. And I have this sort of existential angst now, you know, every time I sort of get into my car, because we've been so confronted with the talks around climate change that have happened. And I thought, I mean, there's just no way I can extract myself from the carbon economy, because I have work to do. I have to get in a car. I have to drive somewhere. And so I'm part of this broken system, but there's also, in owning our brokenness, the potential for finding our wholeness, and the two live side by side. And I think Advent reminds us that we are in this in between. We are broken, but we also are whole, and those two realities live side by side in some way. Yes. But maybe to turn to scripture, and we've got this week the text from Luke, the story of John the Baptist, and I think just as you sort of turn to the Gospel of Luke, Faith, what stands out for you in John the Baptist and his proclamation?
How much do you have, Graham?
As much
No, don't worry. No, don't worry. No long sermons from me. Just a few sort of key pointers that hopefully can open up conversation The one relates to the way in which Luke structures the narrative. And he begins not with John the Baptist. The beginning of chapter 3 is this long list of names and titles of people in power. Well, let's be honest, men in power. Yeah. So emperor and you've got, and it's not simply the political leadership. So you've got the Roman leadership, you've got the puppet leaders of Judea and Galilee and so on. And then you've got the religious leaders, the priesthood. And at one level, I suppose we could imagine that that functions as a kind of a context and background. But it raises for me issues around power, because the one who speaks, who hears God and who speaks God is not connected in any way into those spaces of power. Not a political leader, not a puppet, not a religious leader. John the Baptist is the weird guy in the wilderness, the guy you want to avoid. In a modern context, I imagine John the Baptist being somebody standing at an intersection, wild and woolly and dirty and shouting out, and it's the person you avoid. You roll up your car window or you walk the other side of the road. And so there's this contrast. You've got clearly people who are established and powerful and have authority, and yet God's word comes into and from a very, very different space. And so one of the questions that raises for me is, where are we as the church? Do we locate ourselves in places of power and access in terms, not just in terms of our institution, but in terms of our relationships and how we connect as church with, and it could be in our communities. As a minister in a community, I may be very comfortable schmoozing with the rich and powerful because they can do things for the church. They can get things. It could be in terms of how we at a broader national connectional level build relationships and where we engage and where we invest. So this whole idea of power and access, but also who hears the voice of God, not the powerful. And does power then have the ability to deafen us, to make our sight dim, to make us somehow immune to understanding our brokenness and our need for God's presence and healing? So that's the first thing. Let me pause there.
Yeah, but I think
interject there, if you don't mind, Graham. I also think it's about who are we prepared to listen to as well. Who is given the right to speak for God on behalf of God. And I think we'll pick it up in the other Luke reading, which takes the place of the Psalm. But what is interesting is that these three voices, the Roman structural governments, the vassal kingships of Judea and Palestine, that area, and the temple, kind of all collude with each other for survival and for positionality. And I don't want to say this from a place of judgment, because I do it in my own life. I leverage my relationships and my powers, subconsciously, sometimes consciously, the evil I have done and the good I have not done, right? To kind of survive, to make something happen, considering that the landscape of Luke's gospel is that of an occupied people. So the people who are listening to this story are people who live in their land, but they are occupied people. So they don't have the rights of a Roman citizen in that particular land, and they don't have the rights or the access to power and influence as a landed aristocrat that was a vassal king to the Roman Empire, and the religious space plays this interlocking space of colluding with those powers to kind of eke out some kind of survival strategy for the culture and the language and the identity of what it means to be Judaic, to be a Jew. And those spaces would have legitimized each other in terms of how they understood God, God's perspective on things. And then you got this voice from the wilderness, which who would actually legitimize that voice? You know, I mean, we have the benefit of the gospel to talk about it, but in all reality, that voice is not a voice that we would legitimately say is an, how you put it, an orthodox, theologically sound, you know, relevant voice to speak for who and what God is asking us to be. And so, you know, so I know we would like to think we are on the side of John the Baptist, but actually I don't think we are really when we think of who we are.
We are. Well, just briefly, Graham, just to pick up from what Lauren is saying, you know, what's one of the connections that then emerges for me is what it means to be a woman in ministry, you know, whose voice carries authority, whose voice is heard in terms of speaking for God, as it were. And the whole idea that, and this is social media stuff I read on Twitter, but it's a quote that's stayed with me. I can't attribute it. But a few women preachers have been commenting and saying, but if as a woman, Mary could carry in her body the word of God, do I not as a woman then have the right to stand and speak the word of God in the pulpit and that sort of thing? And I just wonder, do we listen to women's voices? Do we listen to young people's voice as the church?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really helpful insight. And I think also connected to what you're saying, you know, we tend to think the more power we have, the more influence we will be able to have. And sometimes for good reasons, you know, we want to make a difference. We want to feel like we're making a change. And so we feel like, you know, sort of the more platform we have, the more we'll be able to do good. And sometimes it doesn't work that way. I often have that conversation. I suppose it's a bit rich from me coming as a minister, but, you know, people often say, you know, I want to go into the ministry because I feel I'll have more of a voice. I'll be able to make a difference in the church. And sometimes I have to say, well, sometimes you actually have more power as a layperson to really be able to speak and affect change, because once you're part of the institution, your priorities invariably have to change in some way, and you're then caught in dilemmas of sort of where your sort of use of power needs to go, maintaining the institution, following what we feel is God. And those are difficult conversations. And so just that sense that power always equals the ability to have influence or to make positive change is something that possibly we need to question, that sometimes positions of power can be disempowering from a gospel perspective. Yeah. I think we all face that in some way, but just to maybe move us into the rest of the text, just to maybe share a quote that comes from Nadia Bolz-Weber, and she mentions also these big guys in power, and that the word of God didn't come to them. And what I love is just the way she puts this. You know that list of powerful men at the beginning of our reading. You know the ones whose power at the time must have seemed insurmountable. The names of those emperors and rulers and governors and power brokers who were so feared and powerful at the time. You know what? The only reason anyone knows their names, the only reason anyone even says their names, the only reason these tiny, pathetic, so-called powerful men are even remembered 2,000 years later is as a footnote to Jesus of Nazareth. And I think for me that quote just sort of stays with me, that at the end of the day, the way of Jesus is a way that is aligned with ultimate reality, not the realities that we create. Our power systems. I know when we were talking a bit earlier, I know, Faith, that you had mentioned sort of this passage also speaks a lot to access.
Yeah, that was the second sort of key thing that emerged for me. Reading the words that Luke has John the Baptist say, which actually we know comes from Isaiah, and speaking about the leveling of mountains and the raising up of valleys and, roads being, and it somehow connected for me with issues of access in terms of how our communities are formulated in South Africa. So I grew up, just a connection to my personal life, I grew up in a township, spent time working in an inner city, and have now for several years lived in suburban Johannesburg, in terms of where I've been stationed. Just thinking about those three different spaces and how they shape how we see ourselves, how we function, how they're connected to the history of South Africa in terms of apartheid spatial planning, that living in a township means certain things. You have access in certain ways, but in other ways, you really are kind of contained in that space. And the same thing in terms of suburban life, and what then does leveling mountains and raising valleys look like when we look at how our spaces are formulated and what that means for our ability to access healthcare, education, build community. It's very different building community in a suburb than it is in a township. My experience has been you kind of in your own little corner, you go into your house, you close your gate, and that's it. Whereas in a township, it's a very different experience. You actually know who your neighbors are, and there's a sense of being able to engage. And so for me, reflecting on the fact that we still, as a nation, I think are quite divided in terms of how we live, how we formulate ourselves, and that when we move into different spaces, we find challenge. When I transition from township into suburb, into inner city, which is a different dynamic entirely, completely fluid and very different in terms of understanding of how space is used, how you function, how you formulate yourself. So those are some of the questions that the text raised for me. If we're talking about salvation, that God's good news is for all peoples, all flesh, as one translation puts it, which is what John the Baptist proclaims. What does that look like in a South Africa, which is still substantially divided, particularly in terms of where we live, how we live, and what that means for access into relationships, into resourcing, and so on. So that was the thought that came to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we only have to think back to what happened in July to see how the apartheid mindsets and apartheid infrastructure and geographic divisions came into play, and actually how geography does shape our understanding of ourselves and understanding of what it means to live a fruitful life. Our geography shaped that, and because in South Africa you can live this insular life where you can really access your mall, your school, and your comfortable suburban life without ever touching the actual other spaces of South African life in townships and rural areas. We are just so structured. And I think in a way, the gospel passage, the stratification that Luke starts off with, in the naming of the different people involved and how clearly demarcated those things are, kind of echo the geographic, because that same geographic kind of distinction was part of the social structure of Jesus's time, so you would have seen that as well and how that shapes. And so you're right, like, the bringing down of the leveling of mountains, lifting up of valleys, the straightening of crooked paths, those kind of utterances are about access, and access to, or leveling out access to resources, life, the right for life. It are difficult things, they're not easy choices because they touch our comfort zone so much, I know, Graham, you have an anecdote about that.
I was just thinking about just access in not just sort of the geographical sense, but also just in the many ways that people get excluded within society, and just the fact that this this raising up and this leveling that is spoken about in the gospel is hard work. The lifting up, the bringing down, just even in its imagery, is hard labor. And I thought about, in my previous society, we had a significant deaf community that were part of our society. We had a sign language interpreter, and just the extra work involved in ensuring access. Ensuring access meant that my sermon had to be prepared a week in advance so that the sign language interpreter could read through it and find if there were any odd biblical terms or whatever that might be difficult to sign, just to make sure that you'd be able to interpret it properly. It's the extra work of making sure that any video clips were always subtitled, that everything was projected, so that those who couldn't hear could still participate. And just the sense that sometimes we sort of read these words and we imagine that the mountains are just magically going to fall and the valleys are magically going to rise, but actually the action is a doing word. It's a verb. Make straight the paths. There is effort involved. And we would like to believe it's worthwhile effort because it brings life. But there is effort involved in access.
Just to connect to some of our earlier conversation, for me, that connects with the idea of the preparation involved in the season of Advent. One of the dangers, I think, we just as a church, again, it becomes very easy to individualize and personalize my spiritual journey and disconnect it from the rest of the world. But often it's in the kind of spaces you're talking about, Graham, where as somebody who has access, I've got to do the work, which sometimes involves letting go of or taking on extra work so that there is a different understanding of access, so that there's an enabling. And that for me is part of the work, the preparation, because it's the getting ready for a different way of being in the world.
I would like to jump in there and maybe take us to the Psalm reading, right? But it ties in very, so the work involved in like really sitting and listening to our intersectional participation, and the ways in which South Africa in particular is structured, and what does it mean to actually talk about land reparation or access to healthcare, in considering we're talking about HIV/AIDS, we're talking about COVID-19, attitudes to vaccination. All of these things are they are birthed in a cauldron of dynamics that cause us to be suspicious of each other, and cause us to look at our individual wholeness as an identity or entity by itself, but not as a I am only whole when everybody else is whole. And and I think that's something that the geography kind of imposes upon our bodies, and the way we use our bodies to get to our houses and to get to our places of recreation, that we are insular, but actually we are not. We are together. And I think this is what the kind of passage kind of calls us to. So actions of repentance and forgiveness and turning around are not about, oh geez, I just swore 300 people today, oh God, please forgive me. It is that, but it's so much more than that. It's about really looking at how we are connected to each other and re-embracing that connection and learning how to sing our lives into that connection. And I think that's what Zechariah had to do, because Zechariah's song, that's the psalm for today, right? He doesn't know how to speak, and he's the person who speaks for God to the people and for the people to God. So, and he doesn't know how to speak, and in his role, in this birthing role, he can't do it. He doesn't know, he doesn't have language. It is only when he listens to the voice coming from the wilderness of Mary and Elizabeth, you know, because Elizabeth sings to Mary and Mary sings back the songs of Hannah and Deborah and Miriam and Isaiah and the Psalms into her being. Then is Zechariah's song language, because Zechariah's song is a parallel to Mary's song, right? And it's almost like unless we actually listen to the people that we chase away, unless we actually recognize within ourselves that those people have the right through their experience and their lives to talk of God and what God is doing in their lives, we will never have language to learn how to make the mountains flat and the valleys leveled. We will never learn that, you know, and we have to listen to those marginalized voices and learn from them. The fancy university word is they have epistemological value, right? They have weight in our theologies. And so the song of my grandmother, the song of the homeless guy, there was a homeless guy who stole our TV out of Banning Road once. And as he was stealing the TV, he was talking about how he's a child of God. This is all his. That song is important to listen to and difficult to understand and hear and embody. And I think maybe that's why Zechariah was silent. Maybe that's why we are silent until we learn how to sing a different song. So that's my thingamabob. Sorry, didn't mean to.
Can I just pick up? Can I add to that? I really like the way you've made those connections, Lauren, and particularly the connection with the voices and power, because Zechariah occupied within his community the position of power. Mary and Elizabeth because she was barren, Mary as a younger person, their voices are like John the Baptist's voices from the wilderness. But what I in thinking then about holding together these different songs, it strikes me that Zechariah's song doesn't give weight to what Mary and Elizabeth sing. Their good news, their song has weight, it has worth, it has value. By whether or not Zechariah speaks actually doesn't change the weight or the value of what Mary says, what Elizabeth says. And in fact, I like the way Zechariah kind of echoes and parallels Mary. We hear Mary's voice first, we hear Elizabeth's voice first, and then Zechariah's voice. And so a modeling of what it can look like to learn from those who are often marginalized, neglected, ignored.
I dare to say, sorry, finish your thought. I dare to say that Mary actually taught Zechariah how to sing. And
I would agree with that. I would absolutely,
And I think they taught or gestated John the Baptist's prophetic voice, because the language of John the Baptist is Isaiah. Mary, in her response, which we'll pick up like in a couple of things, in Luke goes, "Here I am, Lord, send me." It's Isaiah's voice, right? So like she,
Mary is a prophet in the same way that that Isaiah is, not of any lesser value or any different weight. And so I like the idea too of, in a sense, almost the gestation that enables ultimately John the Baptist to be who he is, and that it's not just because of what Zechariah says. It's his mother, it's Mary, it's all those influences which shape and mold him. And most of those influences are the voices of women and voices from the margins. We just very briefly, a 2-second anecdote. Years ago, when I was in the inner city, we had different services on a Sunday, different communities in each service. And on a Sunday evening, we would have a service in the chapel, which was just a small group of people, reasonably mixed congregation at that stage, a little bit of worship team stuff, sermon, communion. That was the service then. And into that service started coming a woman who lived on the streets, and she was not accessible. And what do I mean by that? She wouldn't talk to anybody. She carried herself in a way that was very protective of herself, and so it translated into a defensiveness. And I suppose some people would say aggression because of probably what she lived with, but she would come into that place on a Sunday evening and sit right in front. And then nobody would sit near her. It just, And one Sunday evening, there was a young couple in church. And for purposes of the story, I'm going to use racial language just to identify. So she was a Black woman. There was a young white couple with a little baby, a toddler of about, 18 months old or so, at the kind of crawling and or walking and or standing phase. And baby crawls up and down the aisle during the service and eventually gets to the front of the church and looks up at this woman. And she looks down at him. And there was this kind of collective holding of breath. What is she going to do? And he looks at her and she looks at him. And all the baby did was put up his arms, and she reached down, picked him up, and they sat together. And after a bit, as babies do, he got bored and he wanted to move. And so he wriggled down off her lap. But what stays with me is that moment of fear almost. What is she going to do? And many of us, and I'm going to use that, were not prepared to listen to her. We couldn't see beyond our own preconceptions of her. And then when she responded as a human being to a child, it somehow was a surprise to us. And that moment always stays with me. Can we move beyond our preconceptions, or do we constantly need to be surprised that the other is the presence and the voice of God?
Maybe just as a side note, wow, as a side note, just to reflect on the power of that story itself. And for me, without taking us on a tangent, I think just a story like that just points to the fact that beyond all of our sort of clever words, beyond all of our theologizing, at the end of the day, the moments that really make a mark on our faith are often just moments of encounter. That moment probably did more in your own heart and reflection than a whole lot of reading could have possibly done. And that's why often, I'm just challenged by this thing of, why do we need to gather as community for worship? Why can't we just live this personal faith? Because we will not have these encounters. We will not encounter the moments that God needs us to encounter in order for real change to happen in our hearts, unless we're in community, unless we're gathering, where we're going to bump up against, the stuff that needs to be confronted in us. So that was just a tangent I went down. But
so dare I say that was an incarnational moment. That was when something was enfleshed that we would have never.
Yeah.
That's God appearing in our midst in ways that, well, actually, that's God always in our midst, but us finally waking up.
Finally seeing, just briefly.
Yes, briefly having a glimpse, and I think that's what the mystery of incarnation is, Yeah, sorry.
Maybe
take us, Graham.
No, I was just going back to that sort of echoing that happened between Zechariah and Mary, and also how John the Baptist emerges out of these relationships. And sort of also a bit of a left side thought was just, how does John the Baptist get to do what he does, sort of in the weird and outlandish way he does? Is he's obviously in a real way got over himself. And how does Zechariah learn from his wife? How does Zechariah learn from Mary, these two women in his family? How does he learn from them? Well, clearly Zechariah got over himself to be able to listen and learn the language of someone else. And I think that sort of behind both the song of Zechariah and also our gospel reading is, I think, for me, just a challenge to sometimes also just get over myself, that God is on the move and God is going to do what God is going to do, and I am not God. I can point to it, I can recognize it and witness to it, but I can't make it happen. And so, yeah, I think that's just a little bit of a takeaway for me as well, is that sometimes we also just need to stop taking ourselves so seriously, because we can't listen. We can't hear and we can't learn when we are the center of our universe. Yeah.
Maybe that's why John the Baptist was in the wilderness, because it was the wild places, because it's a place that's not colonized by, imperialistic desire or consumerist practices. I mean, like, it was outside the principalities and powers that so eloquently listed in Luke's gospel, and I think that's, it kind of echoes also the Exodus journey, that the unhooking or the delinking from our understanding of what power should be and how it looks most attractively in terms of governance and religious orders and economic orders. It has to happen in the wild spaces, in the places that cannot be tamed, and the people who live in those places are also borderless people in a world that's obsessed with borders and binaries. These are borderless people, and I think the church is asked to be there. That's what the church is about. If you look at Paul's writings, we are neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. We are different. We are borderless people, and yeah, we have to do our singing.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, this is a passage of baptism. Sorry to jump in there, but just a passage of baptism. And I think, as Lauren, you were speaking, and sort of what I was reflecting this morning, I had the question is, how much do we allow our baptism to become our primary identity? Is my primary identity, I am baptized? I think of sort of Martin Luther, who sort of returned to that, every time he was sort of assailed by the devil, however we would interpret that in our own language today, he would remind himself, I am baptized. And I mean, Lauren, you've just mentioned who we are in Christ, and how much do we allow I'm baptized to be my primary identity, not my ethnicity, not whatever sort of station I occupy in society, but my primary identity is I'm baptized. And do we make enough of our baptism and renewing our baptisms?
I think for me, Graham, our baptism not as a kind of a security blanket, belong to an exclusive club. I'm in, you're out.
Yeah.
But our baptism really as both a gift and a challenge. Gift in responding to God's love, which we cannot earn or deserve, but also challenge then to live the life of the baptized, and what that looks like in terms of how we deal with access and power, how we, and Lauren's challenge to us as the church, where do we locate ourselves as the baptized community, who are often more comfortable in the places of safety and power than in the wilderness, who would listen to voices of power which look and sound more like Zechariah than Mary. I wonder, and Graham, I know you're leading the conversation, but if I may just segue briefly into the Malachi passage, if you don't mind. Just that one of the specific things that passage talks about is the purification of the Levites, the priests. that's where the work of purification needs to happen. And there was a particular political and historical context to it, but I'm wondering why the emphasis and the emphasis relevant to that context. But for us today, as the church, is the work of purification that God's Spirit is doing, whether we're with it or not, work that needs to happen in our structures, in our systems, in the ways in which we shape ourselves, the ways in which we pay our stipends and take in assessments and manage our buildings, all of that stuff. Just that reference in Malachi stands out for me.
Yeah. And the purification is a powerful image.
It's painful. There's a painfulness for me in the scrubbing and the burning. Not fun at all.
Yeah, and I love the way that speaking about purification, the way that you have, it's a very therapeutic image. And we tend to use purity more in moralistic terms rather than in therapeutic terms. And I was just also again struck in the gospel passage about what the sort of punchline of the passage is that salvation is available for all flesh. And I was reminded just in my own thinking that word salvation is also a therapeutic word. Salvation and healing are synonymous in the Greek, reading of the passage. And even in our Wesleyan roots, we've always sort of understood talk around sin and salvation. Wesley used very sort of therapeutic language. God is the great physician. And I think that gives a different spin on the way in which we talk around these realities, that yes, there is a confrontation that needs to take place. Yes, there is a purification that needs to take place, but it's the purification of the nurse scrubbing the wound, as you said. It's the purification of, putting the Dettol on the exposed flesh, but it's for the purpose of being made whole, the purpose of healing. Sorry.
So I have images of have you ever been washed by an orange sack? Like sunlight soap, like doesn't.
No.
So my childhood is marked by these occasions where my grandmother would walk into the bathroom, which we in her house we didn't have a freezer, so you have to like boil the water, and you'd sit in this metal tub, and it would be mucky from all the stuff that we were doing. And she'd walk in and she'd be like, "Did you scrub?" And we'd be like, "Well, of course." And she's like, "No, you didn't." And then out comes the orange sack and the sunlight soap that gets put on the thing, and the Dettol gets chucked in the water, and then you get scrubbed, and all your sores that you fell off the skateboard and fell off the roof get scrubbed out. But the idea is that you are restored into relationship, and even that purification thing is a bonding relationship between the one who's doing the acts of purifying and you who are part of that thing. It's you are being restored. And I think that's what celebrating this particular Sunday of Advent is about. It's about wholeness. It's about the restoration of God's shalom, and the promise of that restoration of God's shalom being enacted in this world through the mystery of the incarnation in Christ. One, through the preparation for the celebration of this baby that's going to come, but also through the fact that God is always working in the world. God's shalom has never stopped being a part of this earth's vibrancy. And until we are at a point where we are participating in that, we will always be unconscious to it, and I think we have been asked to not be unconscious to it,
Yeah. And so thank you for that. I mean, that's a good parting shot. I don't know if Faith, you have any parting words for us, any last pearls of wisdom you want to leave it?
Pearls of wisdom. I think to come back to the beginning of our conversation around the season of Advent and what it is about for us, and that word preparation. And we've talked about relationship and encounter. We've talked about cleansing, Lauren's image of the scrubbing with the orange. Wonderful. My grandmother used to make me drink cod liver oil. So, yeah. Yes. So there was thorough cleansing inside and out. But that it happens in the context of God's grace at work, always. Whether or not we can see or hear it is perhaps the work of preparation that we're challenged to do. Can we listen to John the Baptist? Can we see and hear the validity of his voice? Can we see and hear Mary and Elizabeth as in a sense, leading into and enabling Zechariah? Can we trust God to cleanse us and still love us? Yeah. And build into that relationship? And then can we do the work with God of the leveling of the mountains and the raising up of the valleys? Thank you.
Thanks, Faith. And maybe just to leave us in the conversation, just with a thought from Rachel Held Evans on the gospel passage. She writes, "We're good at making mountains out of our ideologies, obstructions out of our theologies, and hills out of our screwed up notions of who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's unworthy. We're good at getting in the way. Perhaps we're afraid that if we move, God might use people and methods we don't approve of, that rules be broken and theologies questioned. Perhaps we're afraid that if we get out of the way, this grace might get out of hand. Well, guess what? It already has. Grace got out of hand the moment God, the God of the universe, hung on a Roman cross with outstretched hands, looked out upon those who hung him there, and declared, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.'" And so grace and peace to you all as we journey through Advent. See you next week for our next conversation, and blessings.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.